So, at long last, it's arrived. The live-action Netflix adaptation of The Last Airbender is here. And my god, it was a long time coming. Like, seriously, so long. For me, I was a big fan of the original series, and I watched it when I was a kid back when it was first airing. And then we had that live-action film that came out in like 2010, which was one of those things that seemed like a really good idea at the time, until it wasn't. And I gotta say, not much is more devastating than seeing a classic franchise that you love get butchered on the big screen. But hey, we're in the era of attempted redemption arcs. Recently, we saw the release of the live-action Percy Jackson series on Disney+, and that was pretty well received, got good viewership. And now we have this one too, but like I said, it was a long time coming. Because we got the first announcement of this series back in 2018? My god, 6 years ago. It was set to go into production in 2019. The show didn't actually start filming until like 2021, and it wrapped in 2022, with a decently long stretch of post-production. So yeah, it's been a long waiting period for me as a fan. And so thank God that at long last we've got that finished product. And I'll be honest, I was a bit mixed leading into the release. At first, I was a bit meh when it was announced. I was hyped, don't get me wrong. Love me some Avatar. But at the same time, I didn't think a live-action adaptation was the way to go with it. I wanted a follow-up to the OG. I wanted more animation, please and thank you. And my fears and general ambivalence to the whole thing was simply heightened when the OG creators left the project, citing a lack of support and severe creative differences with Netflix. So my hype pretty much tanked from there, and I was quite certain that this project was going to end up being a flop for the ages. The casting didn't really fill me with that much hope. The still images they released, they didn't fill me with that much hope. And I thought it was all over before it even began. Simply a rehash of the dreadful movie, but this time going much longer. But with the added caveat that there'd be no third chance after this. Any future live action would be dead in the water. And then the trailers released, and I actually thought they were really, really good. Like, so much so that my hype once again did a 180, and suddenly I was fully expecting this thing to be super good. And whilst my hype was dampened a little bit by interviews where some changes were discussed, coming up to this release date, I was still very excited. And then it released, and it seems like the response has been a bit mixed. My internet died just as it was going to release, so I had to wait a few days whilst that got fixed, which really sucked.
Let me in! Let me in!
But I did see social media posts and whatnot talking about how this show was bad, or complaining about changes, and on top of that, when I first looked, the Rotten Tomatoes score for critics at least was a bit bleak. It was sitting on like 50% or so, which, well yeah, that's a rotten score. It has since recovered to about 60% as of me writing this, and the audience score was always sitting around 75%, but still, I think that they were probably aiming for a bit more critical success than they've had. No idea on the viewing figures, as the Netflix top 10 had not updated for me as of writing this, but I'll have to assume that it's probably done quite well in terms of viewing figures, simply from the nostalgia factor alone spurring people to check it out. Remember when the OG cartoon first came to Netflix and it just blew up again, like 15 years after it released? I expect that to happen again. I very much hope so, at least, because it would be a massive shame if it didn't do very well in the most important element of all, viewership. Because that's what gets you cancelled, and Netflix is very well known to be extra trigger happy in regards to that sort of thing. But yeah, it came out, and I wasn't really sure what to expect. I was a bit put off with the negativity, but overall, I thought this was legitimately awesome in pretty much every respect. It was an absolute banger of a show. Like, what's not to love? But of course, we're gonna need some specifics, right? Okay, so we'll start with the acting. Story, music effects, we can discuss that in depth. But in the end, if the acting sucks, nothing matters. It would be almost unwatchable. And on top of that, the majority of our main cast, they're youngsters, teen actors, child actors. And whilst the standard of child acting has overall improved, I think, with the advent of the 2010s and now into the 2020s, there's still a whole heap of garbage out there. And here I actually thought it was good. Like, there were some obvious skill differences between some of the characters, and I will admit, with a focus on episode 1 in particular, some of the leads and minor characters did start out a bit shaky. Some of their lines would come out a bit off. I don't know, a bit flat. They emphasized weird words, or you could really tell they were reciting a script. And like, yeah, no shit, they were reading a script. But I feel like the point of acting is to make it seem like you're not reading your script. You have to make people buy into it more. But of course, as each episode progressed, I think they grew and grew as performers, and they developed into their characters. They became a lot better. Kind of like the Percy Jackson show. Each episode, the acting for the kids was a little better. And I know that in Percy Jackson, they filmed that show episode by episode, I'm pretty sure. So I do have to wonder if they did that here, because I felt like episode 1 was noticeably far worse than what came afterwards. And so I wouldn't really be surprised if that was the case. But yeah, for me, I think my highlight would be the improvement of Zuko. He started off very shaky in the first couple of episodes, which was a surprise to me because he's a bit older than the others, I think. But over time, he seemed to really settle into this angsty, moody, grumpy teen. But he also had this hilarious, whiny quality to him. I'm cool! It was very funny. And I felt like his performance really shined when he was portraying younger Zuko in the family flashback sequences. I also enjoyed Sokka's acting for the most part as well. I thought he really nailed his scenes, nailed the character. But the standout, of course, for me would be Ozai. He had this excellent sociopathic menace surrounding his whole character. I just thought he hit it out of the park. And Iroh, they made him a little less silly in this version than his cartoon appearance, but it does make sense to have him this way because I don't think you could find an actor who could hit those exact same lines in the exact same way. But this portrayal, it added so much gravitas, so much emotion to the scenes he was in. It really provided a good anchor for those emotional scenes, and he was honestly my MVP for the show. Just loved him. Those sad puppy dog eyes he does when he's grieving, top tier. And I also just thought that the main character pairings, Team Avatar, Iroh and Zuko, Sokka and Suki, they had really good chemistry with one another, and they brought their scenes to life. They bounced off each other really well, and I think you can add Aang and Gyatso to that mix there too. Because even when the scripting could sometimes let them down, with jarring, odd phrasing, that sort of thing, the chemistry between the actors was able to pull it back and make it work for the most part. Sometimes it didn't pan out, particularly when you'd have a character monologuing and the camera cuts right in front of their face like they're being interviewed for the news, but when they were doing dialogue, it was much better. Next up, let's talk visuals. At some points, I felt like the visuals were really amazing. I really like Ko the Face Stealer, for instance. Oppa, I thought he was really cute. I thought the actual visuals for the bending was awesome. Then a lot of the wide shots and whatnot, well, you'd see that sometimes when they're doing things that humans can't actually do, it would clearly no longer be a real actor or stunt person. It was a CGI replica person. There was this one battle on a Fire Nation ship in the North Pole Siege where Team Avatar's fighting and then they jump onto Oppa. And that's probably the biggest example that stuck in my mind of when the characters very obviously get replaced with a CGI model. And it does take you out of things a little bit because, well, it's supposed to be seamless, isn't it? But that being said, for how much they had to use CGI versus probably budget constraints and all that, I did think that for the most part everything looked really good. And my overall highlight? Momo. My god. Momo! Oh, everything about that little dude was perfect. His cute little face, the way he walks, the way he moves, his little hands. Oh, I want one. He's just perfection in every respect. Dude has that baby Yoda aura. He's just so cute. I need one. I wish they were real. And then, of course, with visuals, on the other side of the coin, you have audio, music, sounds. Oh, top tier. I really felt like the score just enhanced everything perfectly, and I loved when you could hear the little returning motifs during the original show. Of particular note, when they'd play the instrumental for Little Soldier Boy during the emotional Iroh sections, where he thinks about his loss of Luten, or at Luten's funeral where Zuko's comforting him. Oh, I won't deny it, but those returning numbers, they made me a bit misty-eyed at times. I'm not ashamed to admit that. Got emotional. But yeah, it's just a great soundtrack that did its job very well. You love to see it. Or hear it, I guess. And so this brings me to the adaptation of the story and the characters, and just in general, I guess. So one of the big things they brought from the OG was flashbacks. Whether it's the story of Zuko's youth in the Fire Nation, or of Aang's young days in the temple. They were used to establish backstory and character. But here, they were used way more. Like, significantly more. We see the genocide of the air nomads firsthand. We see a bunch of young Zuko and his interactions with his father and his uncle, really working to showcase the type of relationship he has with both of those men. And I just really love the early setup of Zuko being a bit of a surrogate son for Iroh, showing the funeral of Luten. But I like that they specifically show that he isn't a replacement. Iroh doesn't love him because he has no son left, which is sometimes how it did come across with what he said in the animation, but rather, Iroh loves him and cares for him like a second child because of how Zuko showed him compassion and love in a time of loss. When he sits with him at the funeral and holds his hand and talks to him, just being there for him in a way that that family never seems to want to be. Just so good and really enhances their relationship going forward. I also really just love the little things they do in those flashbacks, like Iroh fixing the way his gauntlets are laced up so he doesn't get embarrassed at the War Council. It's like a dad fixing his kid's tie on the first day of school. And it's the same deal with Aang and Gyatso. We already had a lot of their bond in the animation, but I felt like they went even further to show that bond, to show that connection. Like, it was cute in the animation, but here, oh, the feels! All the feels. And then their reunion? Oh. If you've seen classic Dragon Ball, it was like the Goku Grandpa Gohan reunion there. Loved it. And honestly, this was something that I did notice as I was watching through. All of this, it was far more of an emotional experience. Like, there was still the comedy, still the funny moments, still the jokes, the levity. But a big part of the show was really dedicated to making you feel, well, like shit. Feeling sad or moved. And I think it worked really well, and it enhanced everything going on. But anyway, it wasn't just flashbacks that were used to flesh out the world to show off more character and emotion, but also cutaways, primarily to the Fire Nation and the Fire Nation royal family. And it was here that I think we saw the most change in the story. In the OG, Ozai clearly hates Zuko and cares for, or at least favors, Azula. But here they've changed things up. Instead of Azula just being unhinged despite being so heavily favored, we see what he does to her, that he plays mind games every single day. He doesn't love her, he's toying with her, he's trying to forge her into a successor, and it's breaking her. Same with Zuko, they changed that dynamic. He doesn't just shit on him and hate on him openly. And I would argue that even at times he does seem to almost care, but more care about him like one would care about a prized pig. He wants to shape him, and when he can't and deems him a failure, he casts him out. But even after their duel, that duel where Zuko didn't go as hard as he needed to, he showed too much mercy. I feel like if Zuko gave him the answer he wanted, he wouldn't have been banished afterwards. He wouldn't have gotten rid of him. But since Zuko was unrepentant and continued to show weakness in his eyes, he's banished. Off he goes. And I think I really prefer this version of Ozai. I don't know, both versions feel very real, but this one to me feels scarier. He's more sinister. And it really shows how he's going to be the cause of all this family pain and all the terrible things that are going to happen in future seasons. And speaking of future seasons, I like that they've set Azula up. And I really did not mind Zhao taking a massive back seat and becoming her flunky, because who really cares, right? He dies this season anyway, and then he's almost never referenced again. So I think it's better for them to use him to further that family discord and make Azula out to be a pretty big deal. A dangerous threat for Team Avatar, and a dangerous threat for Iroh and Zuko to have to contend with. She's going to be a major villain, probably the biggest villain of the remainder of the show's run in terms of interacting with our heroes. She's the big overarching villain for the entirety of the Earth Kingdom arc. And so having her be the ultimate force behind Zhao's maneuvering, I think it's ultimately for the best. Yeah, you sacrifice some of the cool moments that Zhao has, but ultimately, it's in service to something bigger than him. Another big change that I rather enjoyed was actually the way in which they framed the Avatar trio, moving the big bond that you explore throughout the season from Aang and Katara to Sokka and Katara. In the OG, we of course have those early romantic feelings being planted between Aang and Katara, but yeah, I don't think that right now, or maybe ever, it seems like the best idea to be planting those seeds. I mean, just look at him, just, he's so little, and he just gives you the ick, right? No thank you. But of course you do need to fill that void because it is an important part of the show. And thus, we have the Sokka and Katara storyline, which explores their dynamic as siblings, Sokka's overbearing ways, as he tries to live up to his father's expectations and act as the protector, the leader, the father figure, much to Katara's annoyance, because she wants to be taken seriously and not talked down to like a child. So it's a bit different from the OG, but it's clear that they wanted to go in a different direction. And I think it really works and it makes a lot of sense. They build it up really well throughout the episodes, ending with that big payoff where Sokka tells her to fight for her dream and battle Master Paku. That was some good shit right there. I also very much enjoyed that deep dive into their family dynamic in much more detail than we've seen before, exploring their family trauma, Katara reliving the trauma and pain of her mother's death, and how that had served as a mental block regarding her bending, and then also the fact that Sokka doesn't even want to be a warrior. That's not where his talent lies, and it seems like something that's been pushed on him by his father. And I expect they're going to dive into that more in the future, with the fact that their dad left them behind, but with more of a focus on Sokka and his role. Because in the OG, it was Katara who clashed with her dad. She was angry because she felt like she had to step up as the family mum. But here, it feels like they've transplanted those story beats to Sokka, adding that additional layer of pressure, expectation, and disappointment. So I'm excited to see where that goes in Season 2. Something I both liked and didn't like was the way in which they really tried to adapt the episodes as comprehensively as they could. Like, smashing together various different plot points across various different episodes so you can plant important seeds for the future, but also not derail the story with an episode that's like 5 mini arcs that are just not connected in any way. And so this resulted in a bunch of cool moments, cool fusions. My favourite was when they enter Omashu, and then you see Jet, and there's also the Mechanist and his son, and they both have connections to Boomy too. All of that comes together in a really interesting way, and it had me really hyped, although I wasn't a huge fan of the payoff at the very end of it, specifically the Boomy stuff. I think I preferred animated Boomy and his interactions with Aang. I really like this version of Aang. He's less goofy, much more naive and sweet, but I did not like the more bitter and jaded Boomy. I don't know, he just rubs me the wrong way completely, especially since it feels like every single adult person that Aang meets was angsty about his disappearance. Like, we get it, man. He's sorry. And yeah, Boomy, he was just more fun in the OG. They bring it back at the very end with their ride on the rail, but no, too little too late for me. But hey, the build up to meet him with Jet, the Mechanist, Zuko and Omashu, that was top tier. Awesome stuff. But then on the other side, this breakneck pace in episode compression / fusion, it comes at a cost. Sometimes things feel rushed. Like how Katara turns up in the North Pole and is not allowed to train because she's a woman. She then battles the Master Paku, she doesn't take any lessons or really learn anything at all. She fights in the battle, and suddenly she's considered a master after being a legit novice maybe a few weeks or even days before that when she met Aang. And now she's seemingly going to be the one who's teaching Aang how to waterbend from scratch. Dang. Didn't much like that, if I'm being honest. Feels a bit rushed. But I guess it's going to play into Katara becoming a super duper waterbending prodigy, similar to how Aang is for air, Zuko ends up for fire, and Toph is for earth. Although I think it was interesting that they seemingly de-emphasized her healing nature and made her into more of a warrior. Like, they're really emphasizing that she wants to be a fighter. So it really does look like they're mix and matching Sokka and Katara's storylines, and I'm not against that. I think it's cool, just something I thought I'd note, because healing's a big part of her character in the OG. And also, speaking of time compression, and I know it does play out this way in the OG show too, but in the live action, I couldn't not notice that Sokka just seems to have some mad game, son. Like, he meets Suki, and within a day, she is thirsty. She's following him around. She's trying to choke him out. Yeah. He meets Yue in the spirit world. She's just speaking to him for a couple of minutes. He says a couple things, and she decides he's her dream boy. Like, yeesh! Like, yeah, it is funny and it was cute, but Jesus. It just makes me laugh. But yeah, back on topic, like I mentioned, sometimes the compression makes things feel wonky. Like when Heibai's anger gets people sucked into the spirit world because he's rageful, his forest burnt, the land's dying, the villagers disappear, and so Team Avatar goes in after them. And they meet Ko, and then Aang also meets Gyatso. But then he has to leave Gyatso behind because he has to save everybody from Ko, so he needs to go and see Roku. And I gotta say, side note, when he meets Roku, it pissed me off that they did not have Roku take control of Aang and whoop the asses of the traitorous Fire Sages. Yeah, the moment they give Kyoshi was all well and good. It was cool, but come on! That OG Roku moment where he comes out of the room so slowly, there's the mist, the fog, and he's so angry, he's raging, and they all shit themselves. That is a top tier scene. One of the best scenes in the history of the show, and they cut it. Come on. Anywho, back to the compression. After this, he's then kidnapped by June, and then by Zhao, and he's put in prison. Zuko becomes the blue demon and frees him. They have a long conversation in a barn, and then finally after all this, he goes back to save his friends from Ko. But he also, I don't think he helped Heibai at all, does he? Like, wasn't that the whole point? Isn't he supposed to heal the spirit? Wasn't he supposed to fix things? I can't even remember him doing that. He helped Ko instead. Ko's evil, isn't he? Jesus. And so at times, it just felt like they were trying to do way too much. And in the end, it started to get a bit sloppy at times. But beyond that, I mostly liked everything else, I think. I liked that they showed off some of the various different avatars, and like I said earlier, that Kyoshi moment where she comes out and she beats down the Fire Nation, it was epic. The fight choreography, that was really awesome, especially benders versus non-benders. Really thought Suki and Sokka were standout fighters here. I also loved the fight in the Omashu marketplace between Aang and Zuko. That one felt like something out of a classic kung fu comedy film, like Jackie Chan or some shit. Loved it. This is what it needs to be. The bending fights, they were awesome too. Love Parku versus Katara in particular. And I enjoyed how they made the bending styles look so distinct. Speaking of which, I did see some hate for Aang being able to fly, or float, or whatever he does. But to me, it makes a lot of sense. If you can control the air, why would he not be able to do that? Especially if he's a once-in-a-generation prodigy. He's the Avatar. Deal with it.
Yeah.
On top of that, love the production design, the costumes, the hair, the sets. It all looked great. And it looked like a lot of care was put into creating nuance within the different cultures. In terms of the scripting, the dialogue, it was a little janky, a little weird at times, but nothing too terrible. There was just the occasional moment of me sitting there watching the screen and thinking, oh come on, nobody would ever speak like that in real life. I love the darkness of the show, the brutality of some of the fights, especially the death by fire moments. Holy shit. I really did not expect any of that, not gonna lie, when they're screaming and melting, oh! But it worked. It really inspires a visceral reaction from the audience in important scenes. Like when their mum dies and she's just screaming, ah! Oof. And I really liked, since the ultimate message of this show is anti-war, that they're not shying away from the brutal realities of it. Young people getting killed, like in the siege in the North Pole. Apprentices who hadn't even finished their training. And yeah, I just think it's for the best to show that kind of stuff. It's a bit dark, especially compared to the cartoon, but it's for the best. And yeah, I think I'm running on fumes at this point. I'm running out of things to say. I just felt like the show was awesome. It wasn't a one-to-one adaptation, but it shouldn't have been. It needed to chart its own course, and it's done that very well. It's a good adaptation. And so I hope it gets renewed for a second season. And so yeah, with all that being said, I'll just remind you these have been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of the show? Do you like it? Hate it? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.